It was a dark and stormy night when young Alice ventured into the woods. She had always been fascinated by the mysterious and eerie atmosphere of the forest, and tonight was no exception. With her flashlight in hand, she carefully made her way through the dense trees, feeling a sense of excitement and fear at the same time. As she walked deeper into the woods, Alice noticed something glimmering in the distance. Curiosity getting the better of her, she quickened her pace towards the object. When she finally reached it, she gasped in surprise. It was a small, worn-out toy lying on the ground. It looked like an old-fashioned doll with a cracked porcelain face and faded clothing. Despite the storm raging above her, Alice felt drawn to the toy. She picked it up and examined it closely, noticing that it had a wind-up key on its back. Without thinking much, she turned the key and the toy's eyes suddenly opened, glowing a bright red. Shaken by the unexpected movement, Alice dropped the toy and stumbled backwards. But to her horror, the toy began to move on its own, crawling towards her with its tiny arms outstretched. Alice couldn't believe her eyes. She tried to run but her feet wouldn't move. The doll continued to crawl closer and closer, its red eyes fixed on her. In a panic, Alice reached for her flashlight and shone it directly at the doll. To her relief, the doll froze in its tracks, its red eyes now dim and lifeless. Trembling, Alice picked up the toy and quickly made her way out of the woods. Once she was safely back home, Alice couldn't shake off the feeling of unease. She couldn't understand how the toy had suddenly come to life. As she lay in bed, she couldn't help but feel like the doll was watching her. She tried to convince herself that it was just her imagination, but she couldn't ignore the sense of dread that lingered in her room. The next morning, Alice woke up to find the toy sitting on her bedside table, its red eyes staring straight at her. She screamed and ran out of her room, her parents rushing to her side. She told them everything that had happened in the woods, but they dismissed it as a bad dream. Determined to get rid of the toy, Alice decided to bury it in the backyard. But as she dug a hole, she felt a strange presence watching her. Suddenly, the ground began to shake and the doll emerged from the hole, its red eyes glowing brighter than ever. Panicked, Alice ran back into the house and locked herself in her room. But the doll was relentless. It kept banging on her door and calling out her name in a hauntingly familiar voice. Terrified, Alice realized that the doll was possessed by the spirit of a little girl who had died in the woods many years ago. The storm outside grew stronger and the power went out, leaving Alice in complete darkness. She could hear the doll's footsteps getting closer and closer, and she knew she had to do something before it was too late. With trembling hands, she reached for a pair of scissors and waited for the doll to burst through the door. As soon as the doll entered the room, Alice lunged at it with the scissors, determined to destroy it once and for all. In a flurry of screams and chaos, the doll and Alice fought until the scissors pierced through its porcelain face, causing it to shatter into pieces. Breathing heavily, Alice realized that the storm had stopped and the power was back on. She looked around her room, relieved to see that everything was back to normal. But as she looked at the shattered pieces of the doll, she couldn't help but wonder if it was really over. From that day on, Alice never ventured into the woods again, and she made sure to stay far away from any old toys she came across. The memory of the possessed doll would always haunt her, a reminder that sometimes, even the most innocent things can hold a dark and terrifying secret.